Is science incompatible with awakening? This is a big topic, a big subject, and we could come at it from many different angles. I could talk about this for a long time, probably, but I'll keep it reasonably simple, and I'll address it from the standpoint of how I usually hear the concern or question about science and awakening. So, as per usual, my only reason for talking like this, my reason for making these videos, my reason for writing the book, was to help anyone who's interested in waking up to do so, or to deepen their insights. That's really why I do this. So in that context, when I discuss science and awakening, it's really from the standpoint of somebody who isn't sure how to proceed with the awakening process or becoming interested in it, but they feel a major conflict with their scientific or logical mind. So I'm going to gear this talk toward that person or that type of concern. So to put it in very simple terms and personal terms, for me, there's no conflict whatsoever. I'm fascinated by science, practical science, theoretical science, physics, quantum field theory, particle science, and I experience no contradiction whatsoever between that and the experience of realization. And of course, realization is, by definition, not an experience, but just to put it in those terms. So the reason for me that these are not incompatible is that they kind of function differently. To try to understand awakening and realization using scientific knowledge is like trying to screw a screw in using a toaster. It's just the wrong tool for the job. They don't really have anything to do with one another in this way. When it comes to realization, awakening, liberation, it's all about your immediate experience. It's about clarifying what immediate experience actually is. Deepening presence through dissolving perceptual filters that make reality or make your experience look other than it is. So what's required for that is direct investigation of your immediate experience. First of thoughts, consciousness, then the sense of I, or the sense of I am, the sense of being, what beingness is, what consciousness is, and then deeper beyond that to what the nature of presence actually is, through the sense gates. What is sound? What is hearing? What is the heard? What is seeing? What is the experience of sight? Are there objects? Is there a subject? These kinds of investigations. Now, it would be quite a mistake to try to take these deeper descriptions of subject and object, form, and so forth, and try to apply a scientific understanding of that to wake up. That's putting the cart way, 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 way before the horse. So just understand that taking a scholarly or informational approach to awakening at any level of realization can be a big mistake and can really help you to avoid the direct insight, which is what awakening is all about. Now, information, doctrine, etc., isn't inherently flawed, and it can be very helpful, but especially at the beginning of this process, which requires you to disidentify from thoughts, beliefs, cognitive identities. You have to abandon your tendency to use information to approach or realize your true nature. So this brings us back to a very practical starting place. If you have a scientific mind, a logical mind, an empirical mind, but something in you is interested in awakening, in realization, and you're asking yourself, how do I put these together? How can I find a place where there's crossover? How do I find a place where my understanding of science can somehow help me get a grip on what awakening is really about, what realization is really about? And I'll just let the cat out of the bag at the beginning and tell you, you can't do it. You just have to accept the fact that you're going to have to suspend judgment for a while when it comes to this process. And the reason for this isn't because of science, and it's not because of knowledge. It's not even because of thoughts. It's a matter of identity, that we find ourselves in this place of suffering, in this place of a feeling of separation, isolation, struggle, because identity has become intertwined with what you take yourself to be in a cognitive, intellectual way. Now, it's not always obvious that this is what's happened, but some people do sense it, that something about thought, something about the way I'm taking some reference from thought about identity, who I am, etc., is inherently uncomfortable. And those are usually people who start waking up or really want to address this process. Other times there's just this vague interest in awakening. What the heck are these people talking about when they're talking about awakening, going beyond mind, going beyond thought? Something about it resonates, and yet you feel very solid in understanding. You really are pretty convinced you're going to understand this if you just think about it the right way. You don't know how many times I've heard, yeah, I really feel what you're saying, but if I could just get my head around it. Don't get your head around it. Don't try. So even if you have a vague sense of this, something about it makes sense instinctually, even though it makes no sense logically, that's fine. It's totally fine. There are things beyond your understanding. There always have been. There are things beyond everyone's understanding. There always have been. In fact, science, interestingly, the farther you take it, the closer you look at something, the more you realize we actually don't know. And this isn't just my opinion. Physicists say this. So my advice, if you're in that position, is simple. Just put scientific understanding, logical evaluation, etc., aside when it comes to this. You don't have to put it aside for work. You don't have to put it aside for your hobbies and interests. It's not going anywhere. Trust me, the thoughts aren't going to just suddenly stop forever. You're going to have knowledge. But do know you're not going to think your way into an awakening. It just won't happen. You have to get through those barriers of identity which are structured in thought and consciousness. And there are various ways to do this. One is to directly investigate the nature of thought itself. One single thought. What is a thought? Where is a thought? What is my experience of a thought right now without thinking about that thought, without adding thoughts? What is a thought? Where is a thought? Just feel into it. You can also do it by asking, where am I? Where's the sense of me right now? Without thinking about it, without adding thoughts. Where is it? Can I find it? Can I settle into it? Can I rest in it? Can I realize I've never not rested in it? We can do it through that. We can do it through that method, which is self-inquiry. There's more than one way to do self-inquiry, but ultimately it's about that. Taking the backward step into what you undeniably are before you think you're this, or think you're that, or think you understand this, or believe a memory about your past, or believe a thought about the future. What are you right here and right now? It's undeniable. That hasn't changed. That's always been here no matter what the thoughts have been saying. Settling into that until there's an identity level transformation. That's what we're working on the first shift, the first awakening. And obviously you can't do that through logic. I had a Zen teacher who used to say, if you think you can think your way into awakening, come into the Dokusan room and we'll mix it up. He means Dokusan room is a private interview with the teacher. You go and sit face to face and work on a koan or work on your practice in a very direct way. Not in a theoretical way, not in a logical way. You're not talking about your past, your history, your doubts, any of it. It's what's going on right now. Let's dig in. And he was right. So I'll make an analogy that I've used before, but it can be a helpful analogy. If you're interested in awakening, if you're interested in this, something about this resonates, even though your mind may, every time you listen to a video, every time you read a book about it, your mind says, this makes no sense, I can't understand it. That's totally fine. But if you're that person, if you still want to figure it out, you want to dig in, you want to see what all the hubbub's about, outside and inside, you want to get to the root of identity, the root of suffering, something about that makes sense to you. That's great. That's what this analogy is going to point to. So the analogy would be something like this. Now, of course, you have to suspend judgment to do this. It's like a thought experiment. But imagine you're sort of a disembodied consciousness. You're aware. There are thoughts. But you don't really belong inside a body. You're not inside a body. You're free of the physical form, let's say. But you can still think, see, hear, whatever. Now your friend comes along and says, oh, there's this cool thing called a body. And you can inhabit that body. We can put you into the body so that you'll function through that body. And then you say, well, that sounds interesting. Let's figure out how that works. Let me try to understand it. And he says, oh, sure. Here's Wikipedia. You can look it up and see how bodies function, how they move, how muscles move. You can look it up. You can find out how muscles contract, how calcium works in sarcoplasmic reticulum, and you can learn about the neuromuscular junction and synapses and how the muscle fires, how it shortens, where it's attached to bones. You could learn all about that, right? Logically, theoretically. But it's totally theoretical until whatever your consciousness is gets jammed into that body, stands up and walks, jumps up and down, does a pirouette, does a somersault. That experience is a direct, immediate, obvious experience. And in one very real way, it's infinitely more valuable than learning about it. So again, you can learn all about muscles. You can learn all about movement and physics and synapses and strength and running, etc. But until you actually experience it directly from the inside, so to speak, then it's just theoretical. It's not what you actually want. You want to feel, run, jump, lay down, somersault, cartwheel, whatever. It's just like that with awakening. If you really want to know, it's fine if you learn a little more about it, whatever. But you have to go beyond the learning. And there is a way to go beyond the learning. And that's what I point to in these videos, in my book. It's what many people point to who've gone through it. So that's the key to this, is knowing if you want the experiential insight, if you want to know what awakening is, to go through it yourself. It's possible, but you absolutely have to be willing to go beyond all of your beliefs, your understandings, your tendency to science everything. You even have to go beyond your own doubt that says, oh, well, only certain people wake up, or very few people can wake up, or, I've done this and that and I haven't woken up. Thoughts, doubts. You have to go beyond that too. You have to go beyond the comfort of mind identification with thoughts, beliefs, understandings. And as you do this, it's very interesting. You kind of hit a fear barrier at some point, and you realize, wow, what I was taking to be genuine, simple, and innocent curiosity about things scientifically partially was that, but sometimes it was actually an avoidance of something, of going through a sort of emotional barrier, a fear barrier. Now, not everybody comes across that, but most people do when they really start digging in to identity. And they really start looking into what it is that I'm taking myself to be and what it is that I actually am, when I realize I've been taking myself to be a collection of thoughts, beliefs, understandings, etc. Now, I want to say one other thing that I find interesting, and this is just a sort of comparison, but scientific-minded people, logical people, don't necessarily have more of a detriment to awakening, but if they insist that they're going to do it through understanding, it will be a detriment. But it is interesting that they see the world in a certain way. Their overlays of thought are quite conceptual, oftentimes. You see a lamp, and you don't just see that shape and form and color. You see glass, you see the bulb, you understand the filament, how it works, you understand how electricity works. Like, you're already thinking about it the moment you touch into direct experience of it. Now, other people don't necessarily move that way. Some people are much more in direct contact with their senses. They're more intuitive, perhaps more artistic. And with this first movement, the first movement of awakening, which requires you to go beyond the conceptual self, the more intuitive, sensitive, empathic, less apt to put a logical overlay over things, tend to wake up a little faster at first. Now, it doesn't mean they're not smart or logical people either. It's more like how they see the world, whether they constantly put an overlay over the world that says, oh, I understand how this goes. I understand what this is. There's a lot of identity built into understanding, knowledge. We're rewarded for it in society. You're rewarded for being smart, for having knowledge. And in some sense, that's fine, of course. But when it comes to this, you really have to be willing to let go and feel what it is to let go of those identity structures around knowing, understanding, knowledge, etc. And I'll make one last point that I find very interesting, and understand this is less important with regard to the practicalities of awakening that I was discussing earlier. But it's just an interesting thing I've observed, and that is the pointings that we use when it comes to awakening and realization and science do have something very important in common. Science well done is kind of ruthlessly empirical. You have to be willing to admit what you're finding and what you're not finding, both. You have to be able to admit and understand the limitations of mind, of thoughts. And with science, the closer you look, the smaller the scale, the faster the scale. When we start looking at particles, when we start looking at uncertainty, when we start looking at quantum fields, things really do go beyond the usual ways our minds operate. Mathematics can understand it in a sense, but it's not a direct way of understanding. It's a symbolic way of understanding. So science really does teach us that if you look close enough at anything, you're going to find a very strange place. A place where time and space stop making sense in the usual way we think about them. A place where indeterminacy is at the heart of what's actually happening, which is not very different. In fact, I would say no different than deep stage realization when you start to experience indeterminacy. When you start to realize that nothing is the way you thought it was. In fact, nothing is any way at all. And any view you apply, any frame of reference you apply to reality is simply a mental overlay. It's a barrier. It adds a little bit of distance that doesn't actually exist. So in my opinion, science, well practiced, and this awakening process and the pointings have a very similar message, and they are, look closely. And when you think you found something, look closer at that. And when you think you found something, look closer and closer, look deeper. It's the same thing with matter. You see gross matter. You look close enough, you see molecules. You look closer, you see atoms. You look closer, you see quarks. You look closer, you see gluon flux tubes. And if you look close enough, you see everything is a field of potentiality. That's quantum field theory. So for me, experientially, there really is no debate between the two. But I really think you have to be willing to suspend judgment for quite a while until the experiential insights catch up. And especially with that first shift, the first awakening, you just have to understand that using understanding, using logic, science, etc., to try to wake up is just using the wrong tool for the job. They're not the same thing.